We'll move on. Hi guys, welcome to the second in the series of webinars hosted by BIM Academy. Today we're going to talk about the power of certification. So I've got some great guests from BSI who are going to talk us through that. I think from our perspective, or my perspective, until recently I didn't necessarily really appreciate the power of certification, but we've been working with an organisation in Hungary that effectively getting them certified to ISO 19650, and that's really brought home to me sort of how it can be embraced within an organisation. I'll talk through that case study at the end just to give you a bit of an idea of the types of things that we've been doing. But I'll pass on to the guys at BSI now, and then we'll go from there. So if I pass on to Rob first.
Hi, so good morning everybody, or good afternoon I should say. I'm Rob Hine. I'm the head of trade and partnerships within the BSI assurance side of the business. I'll talk a bit more about where that fits in the BSI group later on. Been with BSI for just coming up on 30 years and primarily been involved with certification for most of that time, and quite a lot of focus there on the kite mark, BSI's own certification mark. But I've worked across all the different industry sectors and supporting the assurance side of the business within that time, within various different sort of business development roles. But my current role is primarily focused on working with third-party organisations to help promote quality and safety, and also to engage with specifiers and influencers to talk to them about the value of certification and how it can help them to make their supply chains more resilient and robust.
Just send on to Dan.
Yeah, afternoon everyone. I'm Dan Rossiter, sector lead for digital transformation within the built environment. I've been at BSI slightly less time than Rob has, as I've been there for just over a year. And my remit has nothing to do with certification. What I am responsible for, and Rob will go into the detail for, is on the standards side. So I sit on the national standards body side, and I'm responsible for the standards that underpin services like certification, training, and other things that we can provide. And effectively my role is to understand the built environment to help support our teams internally when we're looking at solutions we can help provide the sector, as well as engage with the sector to understand what problems they have that we might be able to help solve through formalising specifications, codes of practices, guidance, or other such things. And I think that's it from me. Graham.
Great. Rob, if you want to.
Okay, so we're going to talk today about, start talking about a little bit about who BSI are as an organisation, just to put some clarity around that. I'm sure most of you have engaged with BSI at one time or another, but we're quite a complex organisation when you get down into the details. So I'll try and put some clarity around that. Then we're going to move into talking more specifically about the standards landscape, and Dan's going to cover that, to talk about the uptake of ISO 19650 and some of the more technical issues around that. And then we're going to move to talk more about certification. So next slide, please, Graham. So I thought it'd be useful just to cover off how we are structured within the BSI group. On the left-hand side there in the blue circles, we have Dan's side of the business, which is the knowledge solutions within which sits our operations as the UK national standards body. And primarily their function is to facilitate the development of standards, product standards and process standards, to support industry globally. We have about in the region of 1,200 different committees at the moment, currently working on different sector focused standards, and only about 5% of those at this moment in time are British standards. So we support the development of European and international standards and the adoption of those for UK. The most important point to make here really is that the knowledge solutions side of the business is ring fenced from the rest of the organization, which means that we are not permitted to benefit commercially from the work that they do. And that's a really important factor. When you move across to the red circles there, where I sit, on the assurance side of the business, where we help organisations to take those standards and embed them as efficiently and effectively as possible, using tools such as certification and training and other supporting functions. So that section is completely separate. Although of course we do talk to each other to make sure that we have alignment. We don't work commercially together in the way that you might think that we do, and that's important because as an organisation, it's difficult for us to be. It would be impossible for us to be facilitating the development and publication of standards, and then auditing and certifying to them as well within the same group or the same part of the group. And the sort of darker red circle there, professional services, again, is another ring fence part of the business, which looks at helping in a more consultative way to ensure clients are ready and prepared for their journey. Next slide, please, Graham. So one of the interesting things I find about people's perception of BSI is that they tend to think that we're a government organisation. In fact, we're not. We're wholly independent, and we operate under what's called Royal Charter. So there's about 900 organisations in the UK that operate under Royal Charter. Some of the major universities, some charity organisations also operate under that banner. BSI is not a charity. My CEO would like me to point out, but we are non-profit distributing under that banner, which is really helpful for us in the services that we provide, because it enables us to be completely independent. So we don't have shareholders, and we don't have those traditional commercial pressures, which also gives us the ability to be very innovative as well. So we can look at providing new services and innovating on the typical types of services that we provide to ensure that we're still relevant and fit for purpose. And any profit that we do make is invested back into the business so that we can continue to develop those services to support industry globally. Next slide, please. A few years ago, we changed our name from the British Standards Institution to BSI to more accurately reflect our status as a global organisation, and we do have offices in over 50 countries now to support clients in 193 countries. Next slide, please. So I think at this stage, I'm handing over to my colleague Dan, who comes from the blue side of the business, and he's going to talk to you a little bit more about those standards and the context of the UK BIM framework.
Thank you, Rob. Afternoon again, everyone. And yes, I'm going to talk about the UK BIM framework. For those of you who aren't aware, we in the UK have been consistently over the past couple of years talking about BIM Level 2, which came about in around 2013 with the government mandate, and subsequently a large push around the idea of doing and achieving BIM Level 2. However, in the past year or so, the mindset has changed following the release of the ISO 19650 series, and we've effectively abolished the levels. As ANCAP says, the levels are gone. What we're now doing is that we are focusing on a dynamic wrapper for these standards that we are calling the UK BIM framework. Graham, if you wouldn't mind. Thank you. And the idea is that as part of this UK BIM framework, there are several resources that are made available. There's a lot of work currently at the moment in developing the guidance documentation. So there are things like our published document 19650 Part 0 that explains how to move from the PASs to the 19650 series. There's guidance on government soft landings, as well as the community produced guidance around the concepts and the delivery process, which you can find if you go to ukbimframework.org. There are useful resources like the recently released information protocol, which goes through the legal and contractual requirements, and then RBIT, which are the standards that support the framework itself. So as part of that, you can see there are, I always have to count each time, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 standards as part of the UK BIM framework currently. And I say currently because it is a dynamic and evolving process where new things are coming out all the time. For example, and this is slightly out of date because of how new it has happened, but ISO 19650 Part 5 was released last week. So that's how new these things are happening. So now we have 19650 Part 5 with Part 3 expected around the 3rd quarter of this year. And as these things are being published, they are replacing standards in the process, with Part 4 expected around 2022 to help support that. And as new standards become published and new concepts become formalized, there's a chance that the framework itself will expand, that references might get withdrawn, contract, change and modify. So it's a dynamic set of standards that are going to support the way that we do BIM here in the UK. And it's supported by BSI, CDBB and UK BIM Alliance as a kind of a 3-way agreement on the best way to take these things forwards. Graham, if you wouldn't mind, please. Thank you. And this has always been the plan. As part of the way that we work in the national standards body is that we look at the way that standards are built from a holistic manner. You can see on the screen here what I typically call the hierarchy of standards. And you can see the blue ones at the bottom are the kind of the private standards that an organization might hold. I mean, personal layer conventions or certain conventions and templates, whereas the red bit is where we start to get more industry and national consensus. So you start with PASs at the bottom, national standards such as British standards here in the UK, regional standards such as those in CEN, and then international standards. And the way that we've planned the development of the BIM standards has been to start off as PASs, which are designed to be agile documents that are describing innovative practices and processes. They were out for a number of years to gain consensus within the market before they were then used as seed documents to produce international standards. And you can see that exactly is what's happened with the PASs, PAS 1192, so have gone to 19650, in the same way that PAS 55 went to ISO 55000 in asset management, PAS 181 went to 37120 for smart cities. So we have a track record in the UK of writing expert knowledge around the built environment, and that we then export out and then gain consensus of internationally. So it's always been the plan, and it will continue to happen, which is why the levels effectively are gone, because this landscape is changing, and removing level 2 from that allows us to be flexible and continually evolve it without having to worry about whether things are level 3, 4, 5, whatever, as part of that process. If you wouldn't mind, Graham. Thank you. Now, we as BSI curate over 59,000 standards, and even I haven't read all of them. And what's important to understand is that you in your roles shouldn't have to read them too. And there'll be a number of people who'll get upset back at the ranch for me saying this, but I only think you should read it if it's really important to the function that you are doing. And for a lot of designers and engineers, a lot of these standards aren't things you need to read. The people who are writing your templates, your business processes, and describing the way that you intend to work, yes. You, if you're just doing the work, maybe not. And so what I've tried to articulate here is that depending on your functions, your role within the built environment, you may not have to read all of these standards. For example, PAS 1192 Part 3 talks about the operation and use of assets, very much in the maintenance periods. You know, why would a manufacturer of goods need to understand that if they are just concerned with the producing of their goods or creating library objects about their products that others may want to use? So by trying to kind of visually articulate this, you can start to see that maybe you don't need to read all of these standards, but it's important to focus on the ones that do impact on you and your role, as well as those outside of the UK BIM framework generally. If you next slide, please. And this is And this is because the built environment is a vast area with all sorts of topics. This is probably the visual I use in most of my presentations, and it comes from the Design Building Wiki, who did an analysis of the links between pages on their site. So the more links there were between topics, the stronger the color effectively on the heat map. So you can see, for example, there were lots of links between design and theory, between contracts and procurement, between sustainability and history, by the looks of it. So you'll notice that with all these topics being interrelated, there's one topic by itself. In the top of the screen, you can see that BIM is an island. At the moment, it doesn't really link out to those other areas. And part of that might be perhaps because it's been dealt with in isolation with its own PASs, creating its own route, as opposed to being part of the wider landscape. However, now that these standards have moved into ISOs, that should be able to change. Next slide, if you don't mind, Graham. And that's because we can now contextualize information management against things like quality management you get in ISO 9001, asset management in ISO 55000, construction procurement in ISO 10845, project management, which is generally in 21500, and construction project management in ISO 22263. There is a whole landscape of these standards that we can now actually contextualize information management within. Interestingly, if you read, I think it's 55001, there is a set of clauses about information requirements. It's starting to talk about this idea of treating information as an asset, but it couldn't refer to PAS 1192 Part 2 when it was written, because those were UK specific PASs, whereas that was an international standard. Now that we have ISO 19650, it means that potentially in a revision of ISO 55000 and its series, it could cross-reference 19650. We could get to the point whereby information management is being described alongside quality management, asset management, and project management. We can start to bring these things together to create a one world, one standard, which is ultimately where we're trying to get to. And hopefully, as the UK BIM framework matures, we will achieve that goal and tie these things together. Meaning that it's not just of UK relevance, there's a global relevance, and especially for those who like to compete and stuff for projects internationally, it helps them break those barriers in terms of how these concepts are dealt with at the national level. That might be me. As I mentioned, future revisions could have that, and we're looking at this idea of the adoption, and to help describe that adoption landscape and to push that forwards, I'm going to pass back over to Rob to continue.
Thank you very much, Dan. So I'm going to take a quick look now at the BIM journey from an organisational level and also like an industry sector level as well. So next slide, please, Graham. This is our pictorial representation of what we think the BIM journey should look like, and it takes a starting point, unsurprisingly, I think, of getting hold of a copy of the standards that are relevant. And actually reading them. So there's a lot of organisations, this is not specific to this particular industry sector and this particular challenge that we face, but getting hold of the standard doesn't seem to be top of mind for most people in this situation, and it really does help. So I would refer you to that ukbimframework.org site, where you can obtain pretty much any piece of relevant documentation that you need in relation to BIM and the standards themselves. You have links through to those as well. Once you've read the standard, you'll probably get to a point where you realise you might need some help with implementation. This is really the educational phase, so it's about understanding what the requirements of that standards is, or the standards that are relevant to your organisation, and how they fit contextually with what it is that you're actually doing. You can do that through a number of different mechanisms. Obviously, there are training courses available, and consultants like BIM Academy, of course, can help with that that transitional process of reading the standard and then trying to embed it into your processes. As BSI, as a certification body and the UK National Standards Body side, we don't, well, certainly from the assurance side, we don't provide consultancy services, because that's a direct conflict with our certification services. So we have a membership program for consultants called the Associate Consultants Program, of which BIM Academy are a member, and they can then help clients to implement those standards effectively, and then help them on their transition through to the next phase, which we would consider to be a gap analysis process. Obviously, if you're using a consultant, then this helps with the gap analysis process quite a lot, and it may actually be that you don't need to go through gap analysis because that's already done for you. And gap analysis is not an integral mandatory part of certification. It's a process to assess where you are and where you need to be, and the gaps in moving from A to B through to ensure that your certification process is as smooth as possible. If you're undergoing training at a personal level, then gap analysis is probably a good idea, and then that can be done by the certification body. So the sort of framework of this section of the presentation, you could say, what's the point of certification? What's it for? And there's sort of a couple of main reasons why organisations would choose to go through this voluntary certification process. The first one is really to get a third party in to have a look at your processes and to make sure that you are operating them as effectively as they can be, and that they are providing the result that you need in alignment with your own strategic goals as an organisation. And secondly, it's basically a very quick and easy way to demonstrate compliance. So if you have stakeholders both up and down the supply chain who need to have confidence and trust that you could be a partner for them in a BIM project, then certification is a really effective tool for doing that. And BSI obviously have our own certification schemes, which are underpinned by the kite mark that you can see there, which pretty much align to all of the standards that Dan was mentioning in the earlier piece of this webinar. So those certification schemes, we operate not just within the UK but globally. We spend a lot of time educating stakeholders both up and down the supply chain about the value of this certification, what it actually means. Now, for those of you that are familiar with PAS 91 and the requirements within there, will recognise the fact that for certain public sector projects, BIM level 2 certification from a UCAS accredited body is kind of set as a mandatory requirement. So there's obviously some issues around that, with the fact that level 2 effectively as a concept doesn't exist anymore. And there are no UCAS accredited certification bodies because UCAS have yet to determine what the accreditation criteria are for certification. So if you feel that certification is a useful tool for you, you need to carry out a different assessment to identify which certification body you would choose to use for that process. And I would recommend that you do that by going through some form of research, identifying organisations that have large uptake of certification in this sphere and who have credible branding, and then basically talk to them to understand what the process is and see how it fits within your organisation. Because of course, when we're certifying, we don't just blanket certify against the requirements of the standard. They have to be applicable to the services that you provide. Okay, next slide, please. Within an industry context about BIM adoption, we carried out a focus group a short while ago to try and find out what the challenges are within the industry. Next slide, please, Graham. And I don't think any of these will come as a big surprise to you. They basically, pretty much all of them, relate to education. So it's about understanding and implementing the requirements of BIM. Confidence in data obviously is a big issue. Trust of your supply chain and the PQQ, the completion of pre-qualification questionnaires. And the rest is really down to the proper education. So expertise, client engagement. We know that some clients are not clear on what they should be requiring from BIM. They just say, I want BIM, give me all your data. And then when they get all the data, they can't handle it. Procurement personnel, understanding what they should be asking for, and a slight disconnect between maybe the C-suite and organisation and the procurement people. Language is obviously it's quite a confusing issue in BIM, so there needs to be some clarity around languages, which is one of the reasons that the standards were updated. And obviously a top-down approach. So unless the senior management in an organisation understand the fundamental benefits to them as an organisation, then they're going to be reluctant to take that path. Next slide, please. So there is a lot of help and support out there. I mean, a lot, and I would again direct you through to the bimframework.org site as a starting point. But within BSI, next slide, please, Graham. We have a number of tools that you can use. We have a BIM maturity tool, which is available on request. If you contact myself or Graham, we'll be able to send this through for you. And it's basically a questionnaire that you fill in, you return to BSI, we will evaluate that, and we can go back to you as a kind of desktop gap analysis and say, well, this is where we believe you are on your journey and this is where you need to be. So these are the areas that you need to focus on to get there. Next slide, please. We also commissioned a digital transformation report a while ago, which is also available on request. There's lots of useful information in here about digital transformation, and in the centerfold there is a self assessment questionnaire that you can fill in, and it should provide you with information about where you might need to focus your next steps on your BIM journey. So I think the last thing to talk about, of course, is the Associates Consultants Program. So with all of this, I always say, you know, if you want to understand where you are on your BIM journey, it's all about education. Go and find out as much information as you can. If you feel that certification is a good step for you, and I think as we move forward and there's more clarity around standards and more clients are understanding the real benefits of this, certification will become a more useful tool. The Associates Consultants Program and consultants like BIM Academy are a fantastic place to start, because they can really help you to get under the skin of these standards and embed them in a way that actually works for you and your organisation. And I think that's my last one. So at that point, I'm going to hand back to Graham and his SAE Budapest case study. And I think, Graham, you're still mute.
I'll start again. Thanks, guys, for the presentation. I think it was a fantastic overview of not only what standards are out there within that sort of built environment suite, but also how they interrelate, and then also how we sort of organisations get support within that space. And I just wanted to talk briefly on a project that we did, or a certification really that we did quite recently, with a company called SAE in Budapest. A fantastic organisation. There's about 200 strong, predominantly work in the Hungarian market, although have worked in the Middle East and Far East. In terms of, we were already working with BSI on what they were, working with SAE on what they were working on at the time, which was a BMW project, which was a very, very large project in a place called Debrecen in Hungary. And they were, BIM was mandated on that project. It wasn't the first project SAE had done with BIM, but it was certainly sort of drew attention to what they were looking to do. And as part of that, they started to engage us around how they implement BIM within their organisation as a whole. And as part of that, so in order to focus that, there was a sort of common goal to get BSI certification by March 2020, and this conversation sort of started in late or sort of middle 2019, and so there was a big push on to try and understand, all right, how do we get from where you are now, which is understanding some of the BIM processes, into a real sort of robust process and protocols that fit in with the ISO 9650 standards, if you like. And so we engaged BSI towards doing a gap analysis at the start of 2020, and this really focused the minds again around trying to pull forward all of the documentation that was needed, with the idea that then if anything needed to change, we would work towards that for March 2020. And the way that effectively that BIM Academy focused that was around mapping a project process. And the project process that we did was mapped around the ISO 9650 standards. So I appreciate this quite small on your screens, but really what we're trying to say here is that there is throughout the design phase and into construction, there are a number of elements that need to be done by certain parties, whether that's the appointing party or a lead appointed party or appointed parties. And there's a number of documentations that need to be mapped out, and the framework needs to be in place for those. So we set this framework in place, the project process, and this is based on the Hungarian stages, if you like. But it's very easy to sort of translate that into the RIBA stages or whatever stages you've got within the country that you work in. And then we sort of fed that through, and we basically touched upon every single document that they would need to have a template of. And so whether that was legal protocol, the OIRs, the PIRs, the AIRs, the CDE protocol, and really fed that through into all the different processes. So once you get to the tender response, there's a need for the BEP and the risk register mobilization plan. And we worked with, say, to define what these meant all the way through, and how they sort of fitted together, if you like. And then this just sort of carries on as you were, and we've got a number of sort of audits, if you like, through their part of the process. They're a multidisciplinary practice. They've got project managers, they've got designers, they've got MEP consultants and structural engineers. So they cover a very broad spectrum of the market, and so it was quite a comprehensive piece of work to move that forward into what they did. And then we did the gap analysis in early 2020. Because of the framework documents we'd set in place, there were very, very small amendments to make to then get certified in March, which they did. And so they now have the BSI certification for ISO 9650. They're moving towards the kite mark. So the difference between certification and kite mark is certifications for an organization, kite marks for projects, if you like. So that'll be the next stage, is to roll this out into projects like the BMW project or the Bosch campus that they're doing in Budapest as well. So yeah, we're still working on it. I think that for us, the power of it was really giving that framework and that accountability, if you like, to the organization. What I found was fantastic about it was the fact that we had project managers, structural engineers, consultants, designers all in the room. They formed a sort of BIM group, if you like, all talking together, all set tasks around what they were having to collate for this gap analysis, and then for the certification after that. And we were sort of facilitating that all the way through with that sort of expertise in that what needed to be within those. But they really took it on as a team, and I think that actually for me is probably the most powerful bit about it, is giving them accountability. Right, we've got a gap analysis at the start of January. Let's get everything in place before then, so it sort of doesn't just priorities don't get in the way, if you like, or projects don't get in the way. They sort of move through that as they go. And that's it for the presentation part of it. Hopefully the guys on the call could all see it. I know that one person's put that the presentation wasn't showing. Hopefully we haven't had any technical glitches to show that. Ian Ramage from Durham has asked if we'll share the presentation, which we absolutely will, and that'll be in the form of a screen recording that we'll send out after this call. And it was really, if anyone's got any other questions that they'd like to ask, then just fire them into the Q&A and I'll push them out. But while we're waiting, I've got a few questions for the guys just to keep us going. I guess the first one, Rob or Dan, was really that if organisations have got a kite mark in PAS 1192 series, do they need to reapply to this stage, the ISO stage?
Okay, so it's a good question. And we quite often have scenarios where we kite mark to a particular standard, and that standard then transitions or is updated to a later edition version. The way that we manage that is to during the course of the next audit process. So we have a scheduled audit process where we go to assess the organisation on a regular basis. We will still assess them against the original standard, but we carry out a gap analysis against the new standard to look at any technical variations, and we provide them so that we update their certification. We continue with their existing certification, but as part of that audit process, we'll provide them with a gap analysis report, just in case there are any issues that they need to address to cover the new standard. And then on the next audit visit, we'll audit against the new standard, and there'll be a seamless transition from the old standard to the new standard, if that makes sense. It did to me, but then I'm kind of used to this. But yeah, so basically the quick answer is you don't need to reapply. There's no additional cost over and above a slight administration cost in issuing a new certificate. But obviously, if you have non-conformities and we have to do a revisited audit, then there'd be a cost associated with that. But the way that we do it with this sort of gap analysis process, we very rarely see situations where we have lots of major non-conformities where we have to do continuing visits to get them up to speed. Great,
thank you for that, Rob. We've got a question from Ian. He's asked is the mapping exercise suitable for client organisations that employ external consultants, or is it aligned to design practices and processes only? Rob, I don't know where you want to take that one.
Could you clarify that a bit? Not really entirely sure.
So can you get certified as a client? So large university, for instance, can they certify to an ISO 9050, and what are the maybe differences between them and a design consultant in getting that certification?
So when I'll put a bit of clarity around certification as well before I go into this. So we do have two different levels of certification. One's called verification certification. For that, we will audit an organisation, and these always at organisational levels, against the requirements of the applicable standards as they apply to the services that you provide. And if you pass that audit, then we can issue you with a BIM verification certification, which basically demonstrates capability. So what it's basically saying is we've had a look at it and you have processes in place. So if you're doing a project, you should be able to provide those services in alignments with the requirements of BIM and the supporting standards. With kite mark certification, we'll actually measure that output. So as Graham said, we look at projects, but the kite mark itself still sits at organisational level, and it still only addresses the relevant parts of those standards in relation to the services that are being provided. Well, I won't go into the detail of that one. That's a bit more too complex for this, but yeah, so that's kind of how it works. So it doesn't really matter if you're a large organisation or a small organisation. We can apply both of those certification processes equally as well. And if you want to go for kite mark certification, but you haven't been involved in a BIM project, there are ways that we can look at carrying out that assessment to support certification, and hopefully, but if we can't, then we'll revert back to verification certification. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Again, it did in my mind.
Yeah, I think it definitely does, and I think from our perspective, yes, we worked with say on that mapping the project process, but there's a lot in there around the appointing party, which is the client phase. So for us, a lot of the information requirements and a lot of the other standards are client based documents, and therefore that they absolutely can apply. And where, for instance, a client may not create a BIM execution plan, for instance, but they will review BIM execution plans, and therefore having documentation in place that allows you to review that documentation is really important. So it absolutely maps across from clients to design consultants to contractors.
Yeah.
It's about picking out what's of value to the certain organisation, and that's something that process map that I showed really sort of helps define what needs to go where. Certainly for say they had frameworks for the EIRs and the AIRs in order to support clients, but they didn't have necessarily a single AIR, for instance, because they would only support clients in doing that rather than having their own. A quick one for Dan, which was, where can I find the study that has the data shown on slide 17? I'm guessing that's the heat map slide.
Yeah, that's fine. So what I'll do is, while we look at some of the other questions, I will find the link to it and I'll place it in the chat for the call. So if you give me two minutes, I will source and put that in the chat.
Brilliant, thanks, Dan. So another one from myself was, and again, I guess I might focus this at Rob, but what's the sort of biggest benefit to getting certified, would you say?
So I think from the ones that I listed during the presentation there, my personal opinion is the one that relates to being able to quickly and easily demonstrate compliance, and there are sort of number of different benefits associated with that particular value from Kitemark. The first one is it's a differentiator, so it enables you as an organisation to stand out from your competitors. I think, you know, particularly within the UK, the recognition and the associated trust that the Kitemark can provide is still extremely large. We do a number of different market studies on these and surveys to ensure that recognition is still high. Within the UK, it's tracking around 66%. When I started in BSI in 1991, it was about 88% in the UK. But what we've seen is a slight dilution of that as we move it more as a B2B tool rather than another consumer recognised mark of trust. So the recognition is still very high, but we've also seen a huge increase in recognition of the Kitemark globally as well. We've been working with international organisations to help them understand the real value of this type of third-party certification and what the Kitemark can provide, not just to the holder, but also to the specifiers as well, because by specifying Kitemark, there's a huge value to them in reduction of risk and reduction of cost. So that would be the one I would pick. I think the support of a third party coming in to evaluate your processes is also hugely valuable. And if you're talking about cost reduction, that's probably the biggest area you'd see. The differentiation and market access piece that come around having the Kitemark are more about increased revenue. And of course, there's issues around risk reduction as well with certifications. So it makes you less liable to be contractually non-compliant. So you can possibly certainly reduce the risk of any litigation from projects that you're involved in.
Brilliant, thanks, Robert. I think that's certainly answered that question. And my next question was what happens if you don't do it?
That's a very interesting question, because what we typically see in these situations where there's a fairly, I'm going to say rapid transition, although we all know that this has been around for a while, is that people just wait and see what happens. So they're reluctant to engage. They're not keen on investing time and money. Because they don't actually know which direction this is going. But I think it's pretty clear to everybody now that BIM is here to stay, and the adoption of BIM is only going to go in one direction. So if you delay for much longer, you'll find yourself behind the curve on that BIM journey that I was talking about before, and you will undoubtedly start to miss out on opportunities.
Brilliant, thanks, Rob. And just the last one from me, and if anyone else has got any more, just fire them in before we finish. But there's a perception, or rightly or wrongly, that that there are sort of entrenched siloed mentalities within the construction industry or the built environment. And I just wondered whether you had any thoughts, maybe Dan could answer this one, around how the certification actually supports reducing those siloed mentality, or that siloed mentality.
So while I can talk about the siloed mentality generally, and then if Rob wants to jump in on the certification bit, he can do. And I think that, unfortunately, I think that there is a siloed mentality, and the difficulty is it's sort of ingrained in what we do. So if you think of the way that we organize our professional institutes, we've done it by discipline and by domain. How we do things contractually, we contract by package, which typically falls under those similar routes. So you'll hire someone to do the the mechanical services for a project or something, and what you end up doing is that those domains become silos in their own way. And I think that becomes difficult because of how you address those sort of silos when they're both contractual, educational, and cultural in a way. And I think that the standards are helping to sort of solve that, because you have things like ISO 44000, which I think is part of the suite that the kite mark considers. Rob will jump in afterwards if so. I know so little about, I'm not allowed to know anything.
No, we don't tell you anything, do we, Dan? So.
But that sort of standard is about forging those relationships and try to understand the value you get mutually from that relationship. The idea of if I work with that person, it's not just what they get from me, but actually what do I get from that, and establishing those benefits. And while you can use it vertically for supply chain, you can also use it horizontally for peers and other people. And a lot of what the BIM standards were trying to do is look at single point accountability at tier 1, so that then all the other suppliers on a project are part of that single tier 1 team. So instead of then having arguments from a contractual side to say, well, no, you were told that you had to give that to me, I'm not going to do my work till that happens, it's you, sunshine, you're now all on the same team. So actually then your failure becomes the failure of your peers or whoever else, which helps to resolve that. And there are forms of contract like the integrated project insurance model and other things that are also looking to try to erode those silos. And I think that we're gradually getting there, but it's so institutional that it isn't something that you can just simply solve by saying, no, this is the way that you need to do it. We need to chip at it in stages. And I think that's why it's nice that we have things like ISO 44001, so that we can start to consider and formalize how we work together, really.
Yeah, absolutely.
Rob, do you have anything?
Yeah, just to clarify around the supporting standards for kite mark certification, we do certainly look at aspects of collaborative working and ISO 44001, as well as customer complaint and base quality management system standards. So although we don't mandate that you have to be certified against those standards to gain the kite mark, and we certainly do measure them as part of the kite mark certification process. And certainly the collaborative working standard is a fantastic tool for establishing those relationships and helping to break down silos. And where the certification comes into force with that process is working with like tier 1 contractors to help them to educate their suppliers and their supply chain about what they should actually be doing to be a partner with them as an organization, and certification really helps with that.
Brilliant, thank you. We've got a couple more questions. So is it likely that the UK government will require certification for public procured projects in the future? Who wants to take that one?
Well, they already are doing that. through the mechanism of PAS 91.
So yes, to an extent.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. And then a question around the change from levels to the ISO. Does the UK BIM framework map across the changes from levels to how the new process is delivered?
So I'll grab that, Graham. So I think in a way, simply put, yes. The interesting bit that is the subtlety that not many people appreciate is that level 1 was never actually defined. It's on the wedge itself, but there was never formal documentation that explained what standards, tools and processes were available to support level 1. Level 3, there was a strategy document written for it, but at the same time, it didn't go up to the point whereby that was also formally described. There were aspirations for things like bringing IFC in as a default, and this idea of more of a smart cities connectivity. And people like Dave Philp would talk about L2C as a primer, which was the smart city convergence, but they were always talked about aspirationally or were never actually formalized. So the only one that was ever really described in detail was BIM level 2. Which was described in the front of PAS 1192.2, which lists the standards, the tools and the supporting elements for it. And broadly, as the UK BIM framework stands now, it's effectively equivalent to BIM level 2 in the sense that things like the 8536 standards around soft landings are included, the fact that it encompasses the 1192 suite, the fact that it points to Uniclass as the UK's unified classification system, the need for an information protocol that we have, and those other things, is that broadly you can map those concepts over. So as it stands now, it is BIM level 2, but as I say, as these things move and evolve, it effectively might become 2.2, 2.3, as we iterate and look at these standards and what they produce, which is why it's been important to get rid of the number bit, because it gets so complex so quickly. What we have is a body of knowledge which represents good practice around information management, and as with all good practice, it changes and evolves as technologies, cultures and things mature. So it's always going to be a moving beast, but under a consistent tag, which is the UK BIM framework.
Brilliant, very comprehensive answer there from Dan, and that brings to a close the questions and I guess the questions that I had in the presentation itself. I think it's for me, as I say, I've always had a bit of a maybe a misunderstanding of certifications and thinking it was a bit of added bureaucracy, let's say, but I think through our work with SAE and actually seeing how it works in action and actually getting those standards in place with standardized framework documents and the guys working together to make that happen and take autonomy of it, if you like. I think it's hugely powerful in sort of moving an organization on from a sort of ad hoc BIM use on projects to actually really defined processes and protocols that they use on every project that they've got moving forward. So I think for me, it's really come to light in the last 6 months how powerful that certification can be, and I'd like to thank Dan and Rob for your time today and explaining some of that. As I said, this will be sent out via email, but it's also be on our BIM Academy YouTube channel for anyone who wants to watch it again. So thanks to Dan and Rob again, and thanks guys for watching. Thank you.